Welcome, everyone. My name is Hiba. I work with Pencil and Paper. We are an enterprise UX studio that's based in Canada. I'm hosting today's fireside chat with Amara, Head of Developer Experience at Camunda, and Akira, who is CEO and Lead UX Designer at Pencil and Paper. So this fireside chat, it's part of a series where we get to hear about UX design through the eyes of developers, something that you don't get to hear or read about very often. And we're here to also just do some myth busting around how developers aren't good at design or that they don't care about it, because we know for a fact that's not true. So with this series, we may not always agree on absolutely every point as designers and developers, but there is common ground. And that's what we're here to identify. So for today's chat, we're going to talk about a subject that's been written about a lot, but I don't know, it never really translates in real life. And the question is it realistic to expect that front-end developers and back-end and middleware developers should learn design skills, and vice versa? Does it make sense for designers to learn developer skills? We know that it makes sense in theory, but in day-to-day, when you're in a busy sprint, when you have a lot of things to do, in what ways do these skills actually help you and make a difference? So Amara is going to kick off the chat. Over to you.
All right, thank you. So I guess to set some context about how my career has evolved over time and where I'm at, because I can definitely say that my perspectives have changed. My thoughts have maybe even changed a little bit too. I was a front-end enterprise developer. So I was the one that was building those front-end experiences for our customers and really trying to improve their experience. But it's really how I got involved in understanding some aspects of design. I mentioned that because I'm sure as we talk today, I'm going to bring in that front-end perspective quite a bit. But I do really want to let folks know that it's not just front-end developers that I think could benefit from understanding some foundations of design. I don't think you have to be good at it, but I think certainly understanding those fundamentals, understand a little bit more about the language that your UX team uses, I think just makes for a more well-rounded team, but still lets experts be experts in their areas.
Amazing. And Kira, tell us a little bit about what your experience has been throughout your career in working with front-end developers.
Yeah, so for me, my first real UX job was a product designer job at an biotech enterprise software company. And I was really lucky there because I got to work with a dev crew that was pretty mature already. Like they knew what UX is all about and stuff like that. So a lot of my challenge was around keeping up with them. But I did really notice, interestingly, that for the newer devs, so like the co-op students and people like that, I really had to give them quite a bit of an orientation. So that was a really interesting experience for me because it taught me that oh yeah, you actually need to learn this stuff. When you're so immersed, you forget that part.
Totally. So I have a question and either of you can grab this one. Is it realistic for developers to learn design skills? Are there certain skills that are very relevant for developers to know and to kind of level up in? And maybe are there some which are nice to have, not as essential to doing your job well?
I could think of a couple of things. And again, from the front end perspective, learning and understanding some rapid prototyping or wireframing tools, I think is incredibly impactful. So my favorite over the years has been Balsamiq. And not because I'm going to sit down and hammer out a number of wireframes and hand that to the designer and say, is this good enough? But again, it facilitates more of a collaborative discussion across the team. I'm also able to go into conversations where maybe the UX team or the UX designer is not there when we're reviewing things with a stakeholder, and come back and instead of just handing them a list of notes, make some modifications or make something a little bit more visual to say, you know, hey, I think this would resonate a little bit more with the stakeholders that we're building this for, or the users that we're building this for. The other thing that I think is really important is, depending on if you're working on a product or if you're working on an internal tool, understanding your brand guidelines or colors and how you use them is important. I say that in kind of a vague way because I don't think you need to know like what level of contrast do you need on a particular screen. I think you can lean into your designer there to help understand. But having some fundamental understanding of that is super helpful, again, not just at the rapid prototyping stage, but throughout the life cycle of the application, because you can make some choices and then go back to your design team and say, is this okay? Does this meet the needs that we have, or does this meet the requirements, without starting from that blank slate, which I think is just, it's so hard to have a conversation when you're starting from nothing.
I think that often when we're working on software, it's so complicated. There is so much logic in it. I feel like wireframing and kind of drawing out flowcharts and stuff like that is such a good skill for like everyone on the team to have.
And I think that the other thing too, as you were talking, I remembered is a developer does not need to know how to run UX interviews or UX testing. But I think that that's also a really interesting way to be able to speak the designer's language. If you understand as a developer what a usability test looks like, for instance, you may build an experience or think about building an experience at development time that's a little bit more friendly to your end users and how they're going to interact with your product or your experience.
Yeah, that's the nice part. Like I've always found about just having user testing as a tool and as like a philosophy, when everyone agrees on like testing being a bit of like the tiebreaker, then I think you can kind of reduce those tensions that do come up, right? Because it's like, oh, 40,000 people's opinions on the team, right? Like big deal. You have an opinion, let's go test it. I think it's really helpful for both keeping everyone humble in this scenario, because, you know, I've definitely tested things that I've designed and been like, oh no. And you learn that like, okay, that approach was actually like bad. I thought that it was going to be good, but it actually wasn't so great. And I think that's, it's nice to not just be like, we need to know all the answers as a team.
Amara, when I hear you talking about like these skills, it's not something that's just like that only the designers get to like utilize in order to make their work better. It's something that actually all disciplines that are working on software, they can take advantage of. So it makes me, you know, like things like how you deal with, you know, feedback and analytics and how you do complexity mapping, all that kind of stuff. Did you find yourself incorporating it into your workflow and it kind of changed your approach to development?
Absolutely. So I ended up getting a UX certification. I understand that that's not always an option for everyone, which is why I've said, you know, I think there's some fundamental design principles or topics that you can look into. There's a ton of stuff that's out and available on the web to consume. Because like I said, I understand that a certification is not always going to be achievable for everyone, or certainly not the certification that I received. But I do think it's important to consider that whatever you're building is going to be consumed by a person. And that person may be well acquainted with technology. They may be someone who uses a computer every day, or they may not. And the farther removed that you are as the developer or the designer from that persona or that end user that you're working towards, the better it's going to be for you to come well prepared with all of the tools and all of the lingo and all of the things that may come up in a conversation, to have some grasp on that. in the tech industry, we talk about, jargon and not using jargon where you can. But when it comes down to it, depending on the use case that you're building for, or in my case, I was building line of business applications. So I had to not only learn some aspects of design so that I could talk to the designers, I also had to learn, what the heck is supply chain and what goes into that, because I was building supply chain applications. Had I not kind of helped myself understand what some of those terms and things were, I wouldn't have been as effective. And instead of having a agile workflow like we were trying to run, we would have had a problem iterating. But having some understanding of the fundamentals, so you can really lean into your experts and say, hey, I did this, or I tried this, or this isn't working. Here's a compromise. What do you think about that? It's just a way more impactful conversation to have. It's more collaborative, and it's frankly more agile, because you're able to iterate and flow much better than you are from zero, or I have no ideas, this is just broken and it sucks.
Yeah, totally.
I like that idea that you're bringing up of like coming to a design crew or your designer with a compromise and having the ability to do that. And kind of like, that's how the collaboration really starts to gel, I find, is when you can kind of do that back and forth and you're like, okay, you suggested something, let me just try this in my design software. Okay, not quite. What about this other, and then you really get a nice kind of process going there.
Right.
I think that's really helpful, rather than like,
Yeah. And actually that brings up a situation that I had where our designer was going off and creating these really beautiful high fidelity designs. And they were so hi-fi that they were HTML and CSS. So the expectation from our product manager was, or our project manager, excuse me, was, you're just going to implement these. And I was like, hold on. We have a set of reusable assets that we've crafted that meet the expectations of the rest of our tooling. They have the same look and feel. They are skinned in a way that if someone is using one tool in supply chain, they're able to kind of use them all because they have the same button colors, sizes, expectations of where those things sit. And the designer was introducing new components that could eventually be reusable assets, but were not at that time. So that kind of created some tension on the team where I was like, ooh, hey, this is a brand new element, or this is a brand new component. We actually need to make sure that it's blessed by the supply chain team and the head of the design team to make sure that it's the experience that he wants to craft and he's okay with accepting across the rest of these applications, should they include it. And we can't just, slap it into production and say, we're good to go. There's other people who need to be involved here.
So ladies, we've covered a lot of kind of related topics to these design skills as well. And I think what's been really cool to hear is how having knowledge of certain skills actually translates in real life. So, it's more than just making things look pretty, right? It's about all of the stakeholder management and everything else that comes with it. So if you had an insight or two to share with designers that may be watching this, developers that may be watching this, when it comes to working with UX-minded developers like yourself, or in introducing this into their teams potentially, what would you like to share with them? Kira, you can go first.
Yeah, well, I mean, in terms of, I guess, collaboration, what I would like to share would just be this idea I think we have in a few different, like, kind of agency world and a few different other sorts of organizations around, like, just hand over the design to the dev crew and just throw it over the fence. And then good luck, guys, bye. and then you disappear, sort of thing. There's a lot of there's a lot of things you can do to like ease that collaboration to get more of what the great experience you want to get built through this collaboration. So bringing in developer buds as you're working through your design, making friends with developers, first of all, and like kind of bringing them into the process, maybe when you get to like wireframing or like things are starting to take shape, to start to get some feedback from developers is like a really important thing to do. And including the backend devs in the crew as well. Some of like my most interesting collaborations have been with like an architect, like a data architect or whatever. And it's been a really interesting process to go through that of like, okay, I'm actually like, we're sharing together the vision for this entire system and working through those problems together. So that's kind of what I would say to designers, like, don't be afraid to get right in there and collaborate with developers. Like our whole thing that we're supposed to be doing is including other people into the design process and making this thing into something that's collaborative. And through the kind of process of getting all these smart brains together, you get to something that's better. I think that's kind of what I would say.
I almost want to answer it in a what not to do. And I say this because I think my teams in the past have maybe leaned a little bit too heavily into this, and it's somewhat controversial. So I would not recommend trying to figure out, how as a developer you should learn design, or as a designer you should learn development through the lens of accessibility. And I want to be very careful about this. I think accessibility is incredibly important. I'm sad every day when I encounter yet another website that has a bad experience from an accessibility standpoint. But I think some teams can get so incredibly derailed by, well, we have this beautiful UI and it works this, and it solves all these problems, but it's not accessible. So we have to go through and redo it. I think just like you're learning elements of design as a developer, or elements of development as a designer, there are things that you can do to not back yourself into that corner. And I know some of the things that we did was we didn't evaluate the JavaScript frameworks that we were working with based on an accessibility lens. We should have, but should that have been the only thing that we thought about at the time we were picking the particular JavaScript framework that we wanted to work with? Absolutely not. Because at the end of the day, we were trying to build a better experience for our end users, and the experience that they were coming from was not accessible. You couldn't even tab across the forms to fill them out in an appropriate way. So I love having accessibility in mind, but where are you coming from and where are you trying to go? If the end goal is a fully accessible experience, or you have restrictions where you have to be fully accessible, yes, absolutely bake it in. But I have seen teams just get so derailed because they're unable to make certain components accessible in the way that they should be, or they're trying to achieve, 100% accessibility, and they can't quite get there for a variety of reasons. So I think that's maybe my tip, is to be really careful about what you choose to focus on. And again, accessibility is what we should all be doing inherently, but it is not baked in to certain JavaScript frameworks or certain enterprise tools in the way that you leverage them. And that's certainly a problem, but I don't think it's a problem that an individual team should try to tackle by themselves during the development process.
Mm-hmm. Amara, now that you're working as the head of developer experience, how has this kind of changed your perspective on if developers should learn design skills? How have you even seen it helping, or sometimes not helping, the developers that you're working with?
Yeah, so let me give a quick explanation on developer experience first, or kind of introduce what that is for folks who maybe have never seen that and don't understand it. So within developer relations, we typically have, or we are evolving to have, 3 kind of pillars or core areas: community, with community managers, developer advocates, and this area that I'm head of, developer experience. Within developer experience, we have the ability to, I guess I can say advocate for a improved or efficient developer experience. What I mean by that is when we have new people coming to work with our tools or our framework or our products, that they have a really good onboarding experience. And it's not just onboarding, it translates across the entire process. So maybe you're evaluating a particular product or tool all the way through to something more advanced. You're implementing it, moving forward. Are you getting what you need? Can you find the documentation? Is your use case something that maybe could be built in such a way that it's more of a sandbox application, helps you with rapid prototyping, things like that. So how my experience with designers and developers has changed is my single persona at the end of the day for making these impactful experiences is developers. But internally, I work with literally everyone. I am so incredibly cross-functional these days. And more specifically on the onboarding side, I work teamed up with the developers and the designers who are building things like a getting started experience, or like built-in wizard functionality for introducing folks to a new tool or a new product, and helping them understand not only from the perspective of, again, that end user and maybe pain points that I've seen or heard from other aspects of DevRel, like from our developer advocates who are advocating both internally and externally for developers and folks using our products, but also in the community. Do we have people who are saying, hey, this product just doesn't make sense to me, or this particular feature doesn't make sense to me, and how can we make it easier for those folks? So my relationship with designers has changed, where I'm providing them a lot more feedback than I had the ability to as a developer in the past. I come in with the community lens. I come in with information from the developer advocates, and I would like to think that I'm influencing the product roadmap and the design based on that feedback. But what I think is super important is I come in with a prioritized list of things that I think we need to evaluate as a team. So I'm not just throwing this information over the fence and saying, hey, somebody came to the community and said they hated our product for X, Y, and Z reasons. I come in and I say, hey, we got this feedback. I think this is the problem, or I think we could fix it in this way. Sometimes that's documentation. Sometimes that's changes to our product or changes to the API that we're that leverages or that works with our product. But it's really more of funneling more information to the designer and to the developer and supporting them in making those decisions. Because at the end of the day, I may be implementing a getting started guide. I may be implementing something that's more like how to, more on the documentation side of things, but they're responsible for the core product, and they have to determine whether they're going to make a change and what that looks like.
Mm-hmm. So would you, in your role, would you look at like internal developer satisfaction? Like, is that what you're really also like aiming towards in your role, is to maximize that?
So yes, there's a couple of things. I think we could get into a very long discussion about, metrics and how I'm measuring an improved experience. I think a lot of people would say, oh, is it like an NPS score? Or, oh, did you, what's the user satisfaction of that tool? We look for a couple of different things. Sometimes it's what's typically, I don't want to say conversion, because I know conversion means so many things to so many people. But we look at, when you go from a trial account or a trial experience, do you convert to a paid customer? Do you engage with sales to understand, what is the opportunity here for your team? How fast does that happen? So we have some ways to measure the speed across, someone who is onboarding. So from the moment that they sign up to the moment they execute their first API call, or they step through a particular UI for the first time, we want to reduce that down so they're as efficient as possible. But there's also that satisfaction element. So do they like our product in such a way that they go and tell all their friends that it's a cool product? I just did that on Twitter yesterday, actually, where I was like, wow, this product is so cool. I've told 7 people about how cool it is. Like that's the experience that I want to craft for other people. And it seems a little bit silly in the enterprise context, because I think a lot of people will say like, oh, enterprise tools they just get the job done. They're like not as cool and slick as maybe product and end user facing stuff. That's absolutely not the case. Like I'm probably going to date myself a little bit when Salesforce was really integrating with everything for the first time, or the MuleSoft team was putting out some really cool middleware. Developers were talking about that like crazy. Like they were just like, this is so cool. It just works. It solves all these problems. That's the experience that I am trying to craft. And I mean, as you hear me talk about it, it is truly an experience, which is why it ends up being so cross-functional. You end up working with the designers and the dev teams because they're going to come in with their own perspectives and their own way to craft an amazing experience. So for the devs, it's, how can we make this faster, and how can we make the load times just really rock solid so that you don't even understand that it's pulling all this data and fetching all of these things from different places. Working with the designers to make sure that the experience works for the personas that we're trying to target. And it becomes a true team effort to create an experience. It's not just this tool works. It's this tool works really, really well, and I like it.
Hashtag devs deserve good UX too.
Yeah, there you go.
Yes. That's awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Absolutely.
All right. We're going to switch to one of the other questions for Kira. Have you ever interacted with the mythical UX-minded developer? Because that's a phrase I've heard you say before. I've seen you tweet about it for sure. But what does that phrase actually mean, UX-minded developer?
Yeah, it's like it's definitely a special type of developer that I've worked with a few times for sure. Typically, they're a little different from maybe the rest of the crew that don't have the exposure to UX yet, where during kind of initial sessions, sharing direction or whatever, they have really good questions. Like they stump you with their questions, which is great. They're really good at finding edge cases or just weirdness or inconsistencies that you didn't even flag as the designer. When you're actually in implementation and doing the backlog grooming sessions and estimation and stuff like that, they really facilitate the group to understand the feature or the design. I've seen that a lot. And then when you're actually building and we're like, are we going to close this story? The things that they implement are better to begin with. So you don't need to do a lot of back and forth. That's been my experience of working with that kind of persona.
Cool. And Amara, have you seen these types of developers in action? It seems like you are.
That's what I was going to say.
You were said developer.
That's not to toot my own horn too much.
Toot it.
But I think that was truly me and my role, and I think that's how my career has kind of evolved. Is I've always had the end user in mind. Now my end user has changed. I've kind of shifted more towards developers specifically and this kind of concept of developer experience. But I found it much easier to think that way and incorporate that with my front end building and having conversations with the rest of the development team to be able to say, if we have a service that we know is going to take 5 seconds to fetch data, is there a way that we can reduce that, because 5 seconds for the users and for the flow that we were trying to achieve was unacceptable. So what can we do development wise? Can we cache things? Can we get data that's, maybe not as fresh, but is in a position to retrieve it faster? Those are things that I wouldn't expect a designer to fully understand. Some of those, for our implementation or for our systems, our technical systems, what are the constraints that we're going to run into? But because I'm thinking in that UX minded way, I'm able to say, ooh, we have a problem if we have to fetch this data from this system, or, in the case of enterprise stuff, it's not necessarily SaaS based, or even if it's SaaS based, it might be still regional. You're going to have latency, and that latency is going to impact how fast things load or how responsive things are. And that absolutely impacts the user experience. The faster that you're able to stand up and tell your designer or your design team that this might be an issue, the faster that they're able to iterate and correct on that. So I guess I've worked with myself as a UX minded dev, but I'd also like to think that I've inspired others to think that way too, so that it's not just how cute of an implementation can we make? Like, ooh, I wrote this in 3 lines of code. Isn't that great? Well, it's only great if it impacts the end user experience in a way that they notice, or maybe in some cases that they don't notice.
A lot of nuggets of wisdom thrown out there. It seems like we, if we were a design team and a dev team working together, we would have a lot of points in common, which is always great to see. So ladies, tell us, where can we find you online?
Hey.
Are you online?
Yes, I'm online.
You found us. You found us. We're right here.
Yes, exactly. So if you want to hear more about design development collab, design skills for developers in general, you can check out our website at pencilandpaper.io. We also are on the Twitter as well at pencilpaperUX. And if you're curious about learning more about the UX skills that you can gain as a developer, we're coming out with a Design SOS course, and you can check that out on our website.
I am Miss Amara K on Twitter, MISS Amara K on Twitter, as well as dev.to. So you can watch me ramble about all sorts of things, from UX issues to developer experience issues and kind of everything in between. It's sometimes a lot. But I'm actually really excited for your course, because I think had something like that existed when I was first interacting with designers, I probably would have approached that type of content rather than a full-blown certification. Certification is great, but I think some people see it and they're like, oh, you're a UX expert now. And I'm like, no, like I did enough to pass the test to get the certification. And it makes me a great advocate in situations like this, where I'm able to remember those like buzzwords and topics and things, to then prompt my design team to give me better information on. But I think it would have been so impactful for me, and I'm excited to see what other people think of it.
Oh, thank you. I'm excited too.
All right, awesome. Thank you both so much, and hope that everyone listening enjoyed it as well. See you at the next fireside chat.